Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Priceless Advice with Leaders of Volunteers. And today I'm absolutely delighted, this might be a very giggly interview between the two of us, to welcome Roseanna Galindo of Periscope Business Process Analysis. And Roseanna, you're also the creator, inventor of the widely used tool, the Volunteer Satisfaction Index. Welcome, Roseanna.
Thank you. Thank you, Dana. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us and specifically talking about your research. So what you have a good academic background. So tell the folks at home a little bit about how you got into researching and how you invented a volunteer satisfaction index.
Yeah, thank you. And you're right. And you introduced Periscope Business Process Analysis. And it's interesting because that's, data, I'm working in the world of data, but my intro into data wasn't recent. It was with the Volunteer Satisfaction Index development. And so I've always been really involved in survey research as a result of that. And I didn't even know it was really data collection that I was involved in. I didn't think about it that way. It was survey. The Volunteer Satisfaction Index originated from my own experience. I went to work in the nonprofit sector. I cannot explain the Volunteer Satisfaction Index without explaining my own professional journey, my own story, because the two are very intertwined. I had started in the nonprofit sector in the early 90s. I was very fortunate to work for the Nature Conservancy, and then I went up to Oregon and I was a volunteer coordinator up there in a small nonprofit. And I had experienced different things in the realm of nonprofits. And I had shared this story with you, Dana, but it's a really relevant story. And that is, as I was leaving Oregon, I was standing in my little office that was above a little deli. I was a staff of one. It was a small grassroots nonprofit. And I had a volunteer named Mike who was coming in to sign up for the next program run. This was like a youth mentoring program. We paired adults with youth for a 7-month curriculum-based program. It was very cool, since merged with Big Brothers Big Sisters of Lane County. But it was, at the time, it was a small nonprofit. And the gentleman that came in had been paired with youth. He'd had this experience as a volunteer and it hadn't been particularly great. Like, we'd had these like poster child pairs who were like really bonded and they really connected. And, our organization helped facilitate that we did some really cool things like ropes courses and stuff with the kids. It was actually pretty dynamic and fun. But this particular gentleman hadn't really had that connection, and he'd already been 2 cycles in. And I just finished recruiting, for this next 3rd cycle as I was on my way back to California to return to graduate school. And Mike comes in and he signs up, and I'm like, Mike, why are you doing this again? And because I've been on the phone with him, I knew how this had been for him. And he said, because I like you, Roseanna, I want to help you. And that always really stuck with me because he knew I needed volunteers. He was putting his own experience, like, well, I like this, this organization. So the reason he originally had started to volunteer had changed from the reason he was staying volunteering. And, that, though I didn't think about it in those terms right then, I eventually did. So fast forward a couple of years, I'm in start graduate school, and it's my first semester of graduate school, and I'm in my quantitative research methodologies class with Dr. Ruth Gusley, who will eventually then become my thesis chair and is still my mentor and good friend. I had to come up with a research project for quantitative analysis, and that experience with Mike popped immediately into my head. Sitting in that class, I'm like, oh, I'm going to research something around, satisfaction. Why do volunteers, stay if they apparently are dissatisfied? I'm kind of curious, what does make a volunteer tick? So I went to the library and I couldn't find a measurement scale for volunteer satisfaction. There were plenty for work, the paid work environment. But I'd been in nonprofits long enough to feel like, no, that you can't just borrow something. At least I knew that. I just knew that innately, knew that intuitively. Then went to my thesis advisor and said, Ruth, I have to change my paper topic because there is no measurement instrument for volunteer satisfaction. So I can't do that. I'll do something else. And she said, no, wait, back up. No, actually, you just found a gap in the literature and you're going to fill it. And
you are the chosen one to create the Volunteer Satisfaction Index.
that day started, and that was like really, it was like within the first, semester of my graduate school work. What was nice about that, I studied, my advanced degree is in organizational communication. So every communication class I took therein after that, everything was focused on volunteerism. So even if it was interpersonal communication, organizational communication, intercultural communication, mass media communication, whatever it was all focused on volunteerism. And so I then spent the next 3 years with Ruth developing the Volunteer Satisfaction Index, had a baby in the midst of that, started a family.
Another small project, just a little side project in addition to the graduate work.
I was actually always say on my way to a PhD, because I was going to continue the research. I had every intention of continuing the research, but I started a family instead. And so didn't end up doing that. Ended up doing 16 years as a director instead of the PhD. I always say they're kind of equivalent in some ways in terms of the experience and knowledge gained, right?
I think that's real life experience. Well, I think I love that superhero origin story of yours. And it also ties into what we know, which is that people often stay or leave a job, paid or unpaid, because they like or dislike their immediate manager. And so the fact that you got that qualitative information from Mike, that it's like, you know what, I'm in this to help you. Like that's a strong personal connection. So approaching that and creating a tool that's now fairly widely used, and for everyone at home, yes, I'll link to the resource in the video description so you can get to that. And together we're actually going to do a webinar for VSys Voices, bespoke software, digging into how to use the tool. So we'll leave that subject for folks to tune into that webinar, which will be free, and we'll link to that too. But continuing on with this idea of people, of the motivation of volunteers and their satisfaction, and having that evolve. There's so many different reasons that people volunteer, but I think that it boils down to, well, they want to. We just don't know what their why or their want is unless we ask. So what have you learned with creating the Volunteer Satisfaction Index, VSI, and using it over the years? Have you seen trends or patterns emerge?
Yeah, and let me say that the VSI was originally conceptualized as having 5 facets. So ultimately, volunteer satisfaction is multidimensional. It's not like it's not one piece. And there's a couple things I guess I need to say before I quite answer your question. I'm sorry.
Please preload the information for everyone at home and me. Yeah.
One of it is the concept of volunteer satisfaction had to be operationalized, and so I worked very closely from a book by Earl Babby about creating social research, and he basically wrote the book on how to create good surveys for social research, because you can have bad surveys, and people don't unwittingly create bad surveys, and maybe they do, but some people just create a survey. So the problem is a lot of people create homegrown surveys and to measure satisfaction or anything, and the problem is you may or may not be measuring that thing, because it can be everything from the word choice of how the question is phrased to how it's laid out within a survey. There's a variety of things, right? So Earl Babby really talks about how then you can take a concept like volunteer satisfaction, operationalize it, make it something that you can then measure. And we do that throughout all social research, right? All social research, we agree that these are the terms that create this. So that was really the thrust of the main part of the Volunteer Satisfaction Index. But one of the key strengths of the Volunteer Satisfaction Index was the literature review that went into it. Ruth was the most amazing thesis chair, and very driving, very demanding, but in a good way, really brought out the best in my intellectual curiosity. And we researched all the available literature at the time, and we created the satisfaction index. And that's what her strength, and what she really does is survey creation. So that's kind of her. I was lucky to find a mentor like that. And we created this. So one is, you can't always create homegrown surveys because reliability and validity become issues. And I think this is the big thing that people, unless you're a statistician, unless you've gotten more into survey research, we have to worry about reliability is, are you measuring the thing you think you're measuring?
Sure.
Validity is measuring the thing you think you're measuring. So validly, is it valid, right? And there's a lot of kinds of validity, from face validity. I mean, you can just read the questions and go, oh yeah, that sounds like something too. Actually statistically, they start to group together. And that's where the deep analysis goes, where you can say, oh, that construct has 5 dimensions, or however many dimensions it has. Reliability is you get the same results over and over again consistently, but you can have consistent results and not be valid. And that's the problem. You can have consistency without validity. Validity is harder to establish. So we established the validity of the VSI when it got published. So I created it in 1999 as my thesis. Ruth became second author, and we whittled it down from like 200 pages to like 40 pages.
Wow. Heavy editing.
Well, after 2 years of her telling me every piece was essential, and it was like the journal wanted it to be 40, I was like, Ruth, I don't know what to cut. You've told me for 2 years, this is everything. It's so important. So she cut down, and we published it. But even though it was conceptualized as having 5 dimensions, the research bore out the validity for 4 dimensions. And this is where this is why it's important to have validity, because we create a survey thinking it's one thing, right? But the research then indicates, you actually have 4 dimensions because of the way they group, because there's validity you establish through statistical analysis. There are really 4 dimensions of volunteer satisfaction that really emerge, and they are organizational support, participation efficacy, empowerment with the organization, and group integration. And those were really the key pieces. And anybody who's worked around volunteers knows those parts. Like, oh yeah, I can see those, right? I can see those pieces. And embedded within all of those was communication aspects, which was no surprise. So and so each dimension, it was originally 5 dimensions, 40 items, 8 items tapping each. And then when it ultimately got published, it really had the 4 dimensions. And what we have found then, okay, so that was the original research. And what we have found is that it has established validity over the years. So I didn't continue on, right? I ended up not going on for a PhD. I ended up going and becoming a practitioner. I taught for 10 years and then became a practitioner in the field, like back as a director of volunteer services at Enloe Medical Center, where I used it. And we can talk about that in a minute. Sure. But over the time, I left the field. Fortunately for me, and for all of us in the field, other scholars continue to do the research with the VSI. So over the years, I've had a lot of academic scholars, not many practitioners in the field, but academic scholars globally reach out and say, hey, can I use your measurement instrument? And academic scholars, academic research, it's free exchange. And so, they publish it. And there's I don't know, I think Google says there's like 350 some odd citations as of now. But what's really cool, the coolest thing that happened in this part on the VSI is in 2011, a research team at the University of Hong Kong in China decided that their research would be to validate, to see if the VSI could be valid in a Chinese cultural context. So the actual research is validating the VSI. And so subsequent to that, there was a lot of renewed interest in the VSI. And for a while, I thought maybe I'll leave the field and I'll go do something with that. But, I stayed as my director of volunteer services and continued doing what I was doing. I would present on it, talk about it, use it as a management tool. And then in 2022, another university did that. University of Novi Sad research team in Serbia also validated the VSI again, this time in an Eastern European context. So over the years, what's happened is not only has it been valid, but because of the validity within the academic world, other academic researchers have found it, and it's found little pockets of use within certain industries. So for example, in Southeast Asia, it has been predominantly used with emergency response volunteers. That was subsequent to the tsunami. A lot of research, if you look up the research, there's a pocket of research published a lot around using the VSI with emergency response volunteers. In Europe, a lot with sports volunteers, organized professional sports volunteers have used it and large scale. So that's pretty predominant there. In the southeast corner of America, faith-based. There's been a lot of faith-based institutions and researchers using it in the VSI in that pocket. So that's those examples of some pockets where it's found its way. And what happens is somebody researches it, they publish, and then other researchers within that kind of find that. But what's interesting is practitioners in the field haven't particularly found it or used it. And I never really put it out there to do much with it until now, because there is renewed interest. And my thesis advisor, Ruth, retired. And she says to me, I want to do research again. Like, I love this. And so I'm like, let's do it. So I have we have data sets. I have data sets from scholars. We have data sets that to go through, and it's going to be a little bit of a process to go through it all. But yeah, we're kind of it's really kind of an exciting time for the VSI because it's been around so long, and I'm just so grateful that so many researchers continue to use it, to find value in it, and to continue to establish its reliability and validity. It's kind of amazing, actually.
I think it is amazing, and kudos to you and Ruth, superheroes, to create this and then have so much time in academia proving that, yeah, this model works cross-culturally in different languages, in different contexts, in different subsectors, like you said, faith, disaster response, sport, things that don't usually have much overlap other than, core best practices of volunteer engagement if people are doing that. So talking about pracademics, taking something dry and academic and practically applying it to your day-to-day volunteer coordinator, manager of volunteer services, director of volunteer services. And again, we'll have a specific webinar we'll do together pretty soon that folks can join to talk about that application. But how are you seeing or in the process now of what's that pracademics, other than in addition to educating people about quality of survey questions and the validity of survey questions, what are you hoping that VSI evolves into in the next few years if day-to-day volunteer coordinators start to use that more as a tool?
What I used it for in those years is what I hope other people will use it for moving forward. And that was really as a needs analysis, I guess, is the best way I can really to use that term, a way to really figure out, just like employee engagement, the literature review really distinguishes that paid work and unpaid work are so qualitatively different that you cannot simply borrow concepts, structures, management styles, or anything from paid work and just plop them into that context, because it's not the same. It's not apples and oranges. There are similarities, but they are different enough. And it's really rooted in volition, right? Mm-hmm. Volunteers do not need to be there out of social or economic necessity. Those two things, which we do for work, either economic necessity or social necessity, you don't have. And so we do have a different kind of work experience. So to understand it better, one has to look at it. What are my volunteers satisfied? What parts of my program are they finding satisfaction? And when we say satisfaction, when you look at how the questions are worded, you look at it, we're really talking about their satisfaction with experience. And really, I think what we're really talking about, we weren't using the word volunteer experience 16, 20 years ago. How long is it? How long is it now? 24 years ago?
Oh, yeah, years ago. Yeah.
But it is. I mean, you look at, it's, how their satisfaction with how often the organization acknowledges the work I do. That's their experience that they're really talking about. And so, are they experiencing that? So that's an area that, is an item that fell within organizational support. But I would run I think I administer the VSI almost every other year. I think I have 7 data sets that I ended up having from healthcare volunteerism. And so I would administer it and figure out where were my opportunities for improvement. And here's the other thing one has to really recognize around volunteer satisfaction. And this is borne out in the article that we published, which is satisfaction skews high. And this is also a break from paid work. In paid work, you can very much have a dissatisfied employee who doesn't leave.
Absolutely, because of that economic and or social, but probably economic, the hierarchy of needs is very different between volunteer engagement and employee engagement. And volunteer services and HR, yeah, there's some Venn diagram overlap, but those are, to me, they're opposite sides of the coin. Volunteer
Yeah.
engagement is trying to create a role that as many different people with different backgrounds can do this role. Many different people can do it at the same time or rotating through. And HR is taking hundreds of people and narrowing it down to one person for one role. So to me, they're very inverse. And the fact that too much academia or research has relied on labor and HR type of measurements and statistics, and then we wonder why that doesn't seem to match our reality if we do try to pracademic it and put it into day-to-day stuff. And so I think that speaks to the value of the VSI. And from those 7 data sets, what have you noticed a trend or anything changing, or has anyone reported back on VSI, say, in the last few years during the pandemic onset?
You know what? That is a really interesting concept. And that's actually something Ruth is really interested in. She's actually really wanting to do kind of a state of volunteerism, like satisfaction post, have things changed, and seeing if it still bears out validly post pandemic. That's actually something she's very interested in exploring. Haven't heard back yet, but sometimes research does take a little bit of lag time to get the results. So haven't heard it yet, but just given the fact that what drives volunteerism, I would suspect, other than perhaps the introduction of more remote opportunities, because it has remained valid for so long from its roots, I think we're onto something with the core concept, the core construct. So it would be interesting to see how it adjusts. And you make such a great point about it being a little bit of the two opposite of an inverse HR. I've often said that, yeah, exactly. Like HR looks at one job, you take all the people and you try to fit the best candidate to most fit that hole, right? And whereas volunteers, you get the people and then you try to find the hole sometimes to where they fit. And so it's a little bit different. And some of us go about, you can sometimes have an opening, you fill it with volunteers, you very much approach that. But oftentimes you get the volunteer first who says, I want to help you, I want to be here. And then you're like, okay, I better find a place for you because I don't want to lose you. So we have that opportunity. So sometimes we have some really interesting challenges in volunteerism and interesting opportunities that just don't show themselves in paid work. Another one is the age, quite honestly. Right. And I've often wondered about this a lot. My average, I had the height of our program before the pandemic, we had about 450 volunteers at our hospital. And it was a very lovely, robust program. The majority of those were over the age of 67, probably somewhere in that median age. And so, that's not true of any other manager in the healthcare system, right? Every other manager, their median age of their worker is not. And so you deal with things as a volunteer manager, like volunteers who start having cognitive decline. Yeah. That's a very different experience.
That also ties into how there's this traditional stereotype, especially of healthcare or hospital volunteers, of basically like, okay, boomer, of older people who are retired, that this has been a talent pool that's been classic or stereotype of volunteer recruitment for decades, which is people who are retired, who have enough money and free money and free time to volunteer, because there are inherent costs, economic impacts and barriers to volunteering, which is other topics of Priceless advice and Tuesday tips that I'll link to. And in seeing that there's this audience in volunteer engagement that's so different from employee engagement and different generations, that's also changed in the last few years of the ongoing pandemic, of people, the mass disabling event, long COVID impacts caring for family members, people passing away in large numbers. But there's been a huge shift of priorities, and it seems like prime time for again, a day-to-day volunteer coordinator to take a look at this tool and see how can this inform my surveys, my volunteer satisfaction surveys, and also perhaps how can it inform how we do outreach and recruitment and engagement based on the answers of the people who are having a meaningful experience, a good time. It doesn't have to be puppies and sunshine, but they understand they're having meaningful impact and they're valued in an organization. To me, that can ripple out to all kinds of organizational communication and strategy.
Absolutely. In fact, I did build a strong volunteer program, and because I was able to, not only did I use it as a needs analysis, but another practical application was simply knowing those areas that satisfied volunteers. I didn't know which one was going to write. I don't know which one's going to satisfy you uniquely, but I know that if I front load that communication and that experience, I'm going to cast that net that I'm going to meet you where you wanted to be. So to be able to speak to those in an orientation, to be able to speak to the impact they're going to have, participation efficacy, right? To be able to let potential volunteers know the impact that volunteers have at your organization meets them where if for those people where participation efficacy is really going to satisfy, be the predominant satisfier, because not these are levers and not every person is individually satisfied by all of them at the same time, but they corporately make up the body of volunteer satisfaction. So yeah, by using it to use it within their materials, to help, recruit volunteers, keep volunteers. I used to always say, I coined the term confident readiness.
Confident
over
readiness.
on my
I
literature,
love it.
confident readiness.
Yeah. Confident
and
readiness.
I did confident readiness, which was, because a lot of people come to volunteer in healthcare and some of them have a healthcare experience, but most people who come to volunteer in healthcare are just community members who have never been in a hospital other than, like most people. And they feel a lot of fish out of water. It can be intimidating to be rounding on patient rooms and to be on a nursing floor, and they're very busy, and you can feel very intimidated in that environment. So I was very, because of organizational support being so high on the volunteer satisfaction scale and things like having the skills and abilities to do the job I've been given, which was one of the questions, I wanted to make sure that we really told them, we're going to give you the skills and abilities that you need to do your job, and then have the ongoing support afterwards so that you can debrief it. And so for our patient ambassador program, that was essential to really make sure. And I was fortunate that I came from a communication background, so I was able to really give them some interpersonal communication training and really get them to a place, confident readiness. But that was based on, I made that strategic decision in my program because of the volunteer satisfaction index saying, hey, organizational support and these kinds of things are really important. I want to make sure I communicate that to our potential volunteers, that they can expect that and get that from us.
And I think that's so important to have that multi-lever approach and that feedback, that information and feedback loop, where it's not an echo chamber, but you're getting confirmation by experienced volunteers in sharing like the good, the bad, and the everything in between that can occur. Because again, not everything's puppies and rainbows all the time, but if you understand that you're part of a team and you're valued and you have meaningful work that you feel like makes a difference, that starts to check off that social need of participating in community. And we know that volunteering generally leads to better mental health results and more building up of empathy, especially in younger people and teens, kind of developing their empathy and their community engagement.
The proof is in the pudding. Our program at the hospital I worked at grew from 200 to 450 because, as we all know, the best recruitment tool is a satisfied volunteer.
And word of mouth.
The best recruitment tool out there is that person in their own circles, their own spheres of influence saying, I'm having a great time being a volunteer at, and you finish that sentence with whatever organization. So the proof is in the pudding, right? It's like, so if you are designing a survey and it says everyone's satisfied, but you're not retaining volunteers, or they're not, or they're not generating more volunteers, your program's not growing, you're probably not really measuring, or you're telling yourself what you want to hear, to your point. So having a more valid tool, right? Because we know that a satisfied group of volunteers will definitely move forward. I recently started a volunteer program for a small museum here in Northern California. Honeybee Discovery Museum in Orland, really cute, lovely, devoted to the honeybee education and awareness. Just started. They actually opened their museum in 2020. Bad time to open a museum, or 19.
Bad time, yeah.
Bad time. But they kept the doors open, and they kept it. They limped along a little bit, but they didn't close. And so as soon as they were able to have field trips stuff, they did. But I started to help them. They hired me as a consultant to help them build a volunteer program. They didn't have one. And I built it, knowing how I can't not. I'm hardwired to the volunteer satisfaction. It's my lens in which I view volunteerism. And so I built everything around that. And I have to say, our first program, our first recruitment, we had 19 volunteers. That's great. It's a small town. That's a win for them. I think we're setting them up for success. And what's great is they have a gal they've hired, and it's really wonderful because I think this is a wonderful tool for new people in the field. And there seems to be so many either veterans in the field or new people in the field. There doesn't seem to be many people in our field with a lot of mid experience. And that's been for some reason, I don't know why. So it's nice to set up the newbies with a really nice framework of, if nothing else, just be familiar with the reason with the article, so you can kind of understand, here are the components and here's why this orientation or this program was built this way. And they're like, oh, I see. I see what you're doing. Because again, people I can't work in a museum. I don't know anything about honeybees. You just need to, you don't need to know that much. You just need to be able to explain, this piece here. Like, it's just making people feel comfortable.
Yeah.
I digress.
And that, well, no, it's true. And that's a good path. It's not a digression because it ties perfectly into Volunteer Pro and Toby Johnson's research that she does every year. That's a survey that goes out not just to her own membership, but to Alive members and CCVAs and other leaders of volunteer organizations, professional associations, that proves your anecdotes. And then there is this huge drop off of kind of mid-career people who, I think, with more people understanding VSI and using it as a tool earlier in their careers, or when they're at their mid-career decision point, I think that helps kind of clarify not just the work they're doing with one organization, but I think that can offer some perspective on their career to get insights like that with a validated tool that really helps. Kind of a final question before we wrap up this wonderful Priceless Advice interview, Roseanna, is what other data-driven tools or methodologies would you like to see in wider practice with volunteer engagement? In addition to VSI, there are other data-driven things like data storytelling, I know is one of your specialties that we've touched on in this channel before. But what do you think people should be doing more of with what tools or methodologies to get good results?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think whatever bottom line or industry net goal your volunteer program falls under, I think you need to correlate your impact measurement to that. So what I mean is, like in the healthcare, patient satisfaction scores drive reimbursement, HCAHPS, our hospital consumer assessment scores. And so, it's great to have a volunteer program that everybody knows, anecdotally knows, is a good thing to have. But we live in a time and age where if you don't have data to back it, people do make decisions like you said, how they'll cut whole programs, because we all preach to the choir within our own. We know the value of volunteer leaders. Anybody who's ever been around, I believe we are some of the most underutilized resources within organizations, certainly within healthcare. And as we rebuild, volunteer is our amazing lever. They're just the PR. Those people, they're so loyal to your organization and your cause. And satisfied volunteer will do whatever they can to help you, and loyally. But you have to really, mean it back and value them. I think that we can really communicate our value better. And I think that we tie things like satisfaction, because like, oh, that's nice that your volunteers are having a good experience. We just want them to do the work. No, we want them to have a good experience, because if they have a good experience, they get their friends to do it too. And we also extra role behavior. I have a whole body of research about when people take on more within an organization. So extra role behavior also happens, right? So we need to be able to communicate that if we want to get the resources. And I think that we just may not be communicating that well enough. It's not just about how many volunteers we have. And I think we all are kind of understand that the impact outcomes aren't necessarily just volunteers and hours. I think we've all kind of turned the corner and realized we need to measure, things like, how many patient encounters, or how many, dog pens were cleaned, or how many, whatever metrics you want to,
mission impact metrics.
Mission impact.
Mission impact. Yeah.
But we need to be able to tie it in, whatever is the driver for the organization, whatever is really the goal, the KPI, that whatever the key indicators and performance indicators of that nonprofit, and every nonprofit has performance indicators like any organization, you need to align the satisfaction and the engagement and experience of your volunteers to that, and show that by investing in the people, you really are making you're driving that forward. Because one of my pet peeves, you touched on one of my biggest pet peeves, and it's the, oh, anyone can run volunteer programs mentality. Oh, anybody can run volunteers. And you see it in so many places. And you see it from as programs get cut, or they just decide not to replace that position and they tack on volunteers to someone else's existing position. They did that here in our local park system about 15 years ago. They had somebody who left, and then they gave the volunteers to like a park ranger, the local park ranger, and that person didn't like it, and it didn't do very well, and it limped along. Eventually they had to, to your point, and they lost a lot of momentum during that time, lost volunteers, had to rebuild. I do believe that there is a qualitative difference between paid and unpaid work, so much so that you do have a different body of skill sets and knowledge that is needed. I am a big proponent of credentialing. I have my CAVS credential. I'm also a proponent of CVA. I didn't ever pursue it. I actually kind of went down that path. Totally am a fan of it though, and I believe in it. I believe in it because the credentialing for me really shows, hey, you need a body of knowledge. Not anybody can run volunteers. It's a very unique workforce, and it takes a unique set of skills. And I think we're undervalued and under-recognized for that. And I think metrics, if they're used well, can help us tell our story.
And that's the core importance of any data storytelling and people understanding that. And I really appreciate you, Roseanna, being on Priceless Advice and taking very complex ideas of academia that I know some people can feel like overwhelmed or it's going to be too dry. But I love your approach and your enthusiasm. And my training in doing education work and teaching the teachers and training the trainers and doing performance is interesting, and passion is contagious. And yeah, we're in a data-driven society at this point, and you can, hopefully everyone's using it for the powers of good. Yeah, in their organization, because like any tool in the toolbox, it can be used, any way that humans want to use it. But I'm a big fan now of the Volunteer Satisfaction Index. I want to bring it to people's attention, and all of your other excellent points that we've covered today. And if there's a closing thought that you have for the Priceless Advice viewers at home, either inspirational or one more good little information nugget, feel free to share.
Yeah, I think my one thing is I'm so excited that you have this show. What I love is that, I mean, you've been in this field for many years, as have I. And it's I think I started in 1992 was my first gig as a volunteer coordinator. There were very little resources out there. There was a couple, but very little. Susan Ellis was out there, thank God, but other than that, really Energize and Nonprofit Times or Quarterly, Nonprofit Times, I think, was out there for as a job ad paper. But there really wasn't much in the way of resources. I think it's amazing that in the nonprofit sector, what I'm blown away at, when I go to the library in 1995 to go look for a volunteer satisfaction index, there isn't something like that, right? There isn't. There was very little research, really. I mean, and I look forward now, I'm blown away by just that nonprofit and volunteerism research has really blown up, and we know so much. There are so many great resources like yours, like Alive, like Energize. There's amazing people producing great resources that really can support volunteer leaders in ways that wasn't available years ago. And I really, take advantage of the resources and the knowledge and wisdom and experience of those who have been there. And it's great. I love that you're doing this.
Thank you so much. And that was the whole point of trying Priceless Advice and launching in February of 2020. Speaking of good timing, to go on with free online resources. And I've been really excited to see colleagues like, Rob Jackson and again, Toby Johnson, Jennifer Bennett. They have an audio podcast they do, Rock Stars. Nicole R. Smith is, she started a video podcast. So, for all the jokes about everyone's got a podcast, like this is really important information for everybody to have that isn't behind a paywall. And I'm happy to contribute to that. And once again, it's just, well, one, we like talking to each other. So this was as much for us being able to just chat and have a good time. But I think I have found this very informative. And even with previous conversations with you, I learned so much more in this Priceless Advice conversation today. So thanks again, Roseanna Galindo of Periscope Business Process Analytics, for beaming in, yeah, there you go, mirror image time. And again, this will have so many links and resources in the description, and I'm just really glad that we were able to take the time together today and let people know about Volunteer Satisfaction Index and data storytelling in general. I might have you back for more because these are deep topics.
Thank you. You're a rock star. Thank you.